In Naruto, the protagonist, Naruto Uzumaki, is known for being a cheerful hard worker. He's often branded as being overly simplistic and constantly carrying a can do attitude. And of course, Naruto is also known for never giving up regardless of the challenges and foes that he goes up against. In fact, there was a recent study, which you may have stumbled upon online, that found that watching Naruto contributed positively to resilience, identity formation, and emotional coping amongst adolescents that grew up watching it. In this sense, Naruto serves as the ultimate idealist in the story, but more specifically, he represents something deeper, an idealistic reformer. Naruto looks at the world that is broken and still believes that it can somehow be healed. However, this mindset meets its greatest challenge and foe in the character Pain.
ここより世界に痛みを神羅転生
Pain, or Nagato Uzumaki, is one of the best written villains in Naruto, and like many of the villains in Naruto, he did not begin as evil, but his life, marked by war, loss, and betrayal, slowly began to change him. The death of his parents, the loss of his best friend, and the failure of those in authority became the lens through which he begins to see reality. He eventually came to the conclusion that the world wasn't just broken, it was beyond repair. This is the moment Nagato stops being a reformer and becomes a revolutionist. Nagato eventually stopped believing that the world could be healed. He instead started to believe that the world must be forced into peace through suffering. That only by inflicting enough pain will humanity finally desire peace. At the core of his belief is this: the system is broken and you cannot fix it. And therefore, you have to destroy it and start again. In fact, this is what makes his confrontation with Naruto so powerful. It is not simply a battle of strength, but a clash between two responses to a broken world. It is a clash between two ideologies: idealistic reformer and a nihilistic revolutionist. Do you remain and reform, or do you abandon, destroy, and rebuild something new? This is why the moment where Pain asks Naruto if he can forgive him is so important, because what he really is asking is not just about forgiveness. He's asking, what kind of person will you be?
You asked me why I'm doing all this. My goal is to fulfill the dream even Jiraiya Sensei was unable to achieve. What I want is to create peace and bring about justice. Then tell me, what is your goal?
First, I'm gonna kill you! And then, I'm gonna bring peace to the ninja world!
That would be justice. However, what about my family? My friends? My village?
Naruto is now faced with something that he cannot solve by fighting. It's easy to speak about forgiveness and about peace when you have not been deeply wronged. And it is easy to talk about forgiveness when justice has not been violated. But when you stand before the person that has caused you so much suffering, all of a sudden everything becomes much more real. And what's really interesting about this moment is that Naruto actually doesn't answer his question, because Pain is right about one thing. If Naruto chooses revenge, he proves Pain's point. The cycle continues and Pain creates Naruto, and Naruto becomes the next Pain. This is the cycle of hatred that runs through the entire world of Naruto. Violence gives birth to violence, hate produces more hate. Every act of revenge creates a new victim, and every victim carries the seed of future revenge. To you, your enemies are terrorists, but to your enemies, you are the terrorist. And this is where this revolutionary mindset becomes dangerous. Because once you start believing that something is beyond saving, destruction, suffering, pain, genocide even, can begin to feel justified. Even Naruto almost falls into this trap, and he says that he's going to kill Pain and then create peace. In that moment, he is thinking exactly like the person he opposes. When he does confront Pain, Nagato, instead of fighting Nagato, he asks Nagato to tell him his story. And in doing so, Naruto realizes something deeply uncomfortable. the enemy that he wanted to destroy is not a monster, it's not a god, as Pain would describe himself, but rather simply a man who has been shaped by suffering. But here is where Naruto makes a different choice. You see, many of us would like to take the comfortable and easy route. We would like to say that this person is an enemy and I do not need to understand where they're coming from because they are the enemy and I don't need to understand where they're coming from. This is how we see so many wars happening in the Middle East, right? How often do we hear people in our families, people in our communities say that these people in the Middle East are just terrorists, they are just, hooligans, and they are just, ruffians, and we should just bomb them, and they don't really matter that much because we've branded them as terrorists. But how often also do we go the opposite route and we start to say that, you know what, there's no such thing as morality and that everything is sort of just subjective. But here is where Naruto makes a very interesting choice, and it's a choice that we should also make. Naruto does not abandon his beliefs, he doesn't even compromise on his beliefs. But more importantly, he does not walk away. Naruto stays.
俺は諦めねえ。
お前はどうして自分が変わらないと言い切れる？
俺だって痛みはあった。どんなに痛えことがあっても歩いてく。それが
And so Naruto remains an idealist, but he becomes a realistic idealist, a tested reformer, someone who sees the brokenness clearly and still chooses not to destroy what remains. And this is where the parallel to Christian life becomes very, very, very real and relatable. Because the same exact question exists within churches today. When you encounter corruption, hypocrisy, or pain within the church hurt as we call it, right? Many of us come to the same conclusion that Pain did. The system is broken, the church is broken, and it is beyond repair. And therefore, it has to be destroyed and be rebuilt, or somehow just leave, right? And now, to be fair, the problems are real, right? Clergy scandals, poor leadership, parish politics, coal communities, liturgical tensions, bureaucracy, red tapes, bad financial usage by your priest or your pastor. It can feel more like an institution rather than a church. And these are not small frustrations that leave tiny scratches on your faith. They are real big gashes, right? They leave gaping open wounds on your faith. And like I said, this is the moment where many of us stop being reformers and we become revolutionists. And that's easy to do. But you know what's really hard to do? To remain a reformer in the face of all of these problems. And by the way, when I say reformer, I don't mean like this. I mean like this. So not Martin Luther reformer, but like Saint Francis of Assisi reformer, like Saint John Vianney. So I'm not talking about like reforming the church in the Protestant sense. I'm talking about the church being reformed in the Catholic sense. To remain means to stay in a place where you can clearly see the flaws, right? It means resisting both naivety and cynicism. But it also means acknowledging that the church is wounded without concluding that it is worthless. And this is like the hardest thing to do, right? Because really, what you need to do to be an actual reformer, right? Not like the Protestant reformers, but like an actual reformer in the church, you will have to hold two truths at the same time, right? And these two truths are that the church is holy, but the church is also full of sinners. And more importantly, that reform does not begin by changing structures, but by personal conversions. This is why saints like Saint Francis of Assisi or Saint John Vianney are so important, because they saw the corruption, but they still stayed. And they actually made a lot of efforts to change things from within, but they never left. And that is really the cost of being a reformer. You're not going to get the satisfaction of walking away, or the satisfaction of burning everything to the ground, or the satisfaction of telling someone to the face. You're not going to get that, but you're going to get this very long process of change, right? And you're going to have to carry that burden of staying. And that brings us to the second question. Like the first part's like hard enough, but this is like where it gets really hard, right? Like staying and being a reformer is hard, but I think like the harder thing to do is like how do you like engage with people who have left? How do you engage with revolutionists? Because many of these revolutionists that we see in our churches, right, people who want to do things their own way, or people who want to leave the church and start their own churches, or maybe leave the church and join, like a different denomination, they are not bad people. They're like Pain. They're not villains at heart. They are simply very wounded. These people may have left the church, they may have joined other communities or started their own communities, and they may even speak critically or harshly about the church. And of course, the temptation that we have is to immediately be like, what? Like, argue, correct them, win, 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 you lose, you're a heretic. That's like the knee jerk reaction that we have. But what even is the point of that, right? Like, if you do that, like, aren't we just missing the point entirely? And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to lecture you. Like, I have done this too, and I'm trying to work on myself so that I don't continue doing this stuff, right? Because when you look at the story of Naruto, right, he doesn't begin by correcting Pain. He begins by listening. He takes his suffering seriously. And I think this is where many of us Catholics struggle. Because again, that sort of tension is there, right? Because if you become too passive and say nothing, that's bad, right? Or if you become too aggressive and you like keep trying to like shut down conversations, you keep trying to like win arguments, like that's bad too. And so I think that there needs to be a nuanced take here, right? We need to be like Naruto, right? We need to listen without surrendering the truth. We need to acknowledge their pain without affirming their errors. And we need to remain firm in our conviction, firm in our faith, firm in what we know is right and true, and yet still have a gentle approach. Because if someone has left the church because of church hurt or pain, they are not asking for arguments here. They're asking if anyone understands what they've gone through. Now, this does not mean that we have to agree with their decision to leave, but it does mean that we have to recognize that behind that decision to leave the church, to abandon their faith, is often a story. And don't get me wrong, not all of them stories are valid, not all of their stories are legit, right? Not all of their stories are worth listening to. Some of them genuinely just left because they don't care. But some of them left because of pain, because of suffering, because of church hurt. And those stories are worth listening to. Because if we never hear their story, then we will never reach the person. This is what talk no jutsu is all about in Naruto. But it's interesting because it's not about talking someone into submission, it's not about debating them. And it's not even about winning the argument. Instead, it's about encountering them as a person. And this brings us to our final takeaway. When we meet people who have left the church, the question is not simply whether they are right or wrong. The question is, will we respond as reformers or as revolutionists ourselves? Because in the end, it is far easier to just walk away and start again. And it is far harder to remain, to endure, and to love anyway, despite the problems. And that, my dear friends, is the difference between a revolutionist and a reformer. As Catholics, we ought to be like Naruto. We ought to be reformers in the Saint Francis of Assisi way, not in the Martin Luther John Calvin way, right? Because being a reformer is vital in ensuring that our church remains true to itself whilst flourishing. I guess you could say that that should be our ninja way or our Catholic way.